if you really think about it, ambiguity is what makes something terrifying. I mean, the unknown is unsettling, sure, but by itself, the unknown is vague. It's distant, out of focus. It's like walking through a forest alone at night. It's creepy, but you're never sure what to be afraid of. And because of that, your fear lies in the potential, which feels abstract, like there's some distance between you and whatever it is that could be out there. Ambiguity, on the other hand, is what happens when the unknown grows teeth. It's the difference between walking home alone at night and walking home alone at night when you suddenly hear something scuttle behind you. The first is potential. The second is immediate. Now, there's something there, and it forces your brain to choose a threat level. Whatever it was could be dangerous, but it could also be harmless. Regardless, it exists within a gray zone, and gray zones are conflicting, which is why I was so struck when I stumbled upon these videos about the Uncanny Valley. Clearly, the ambiguity of something being almost human, but not quite, is what creates the discomfort. But it wasn't just the Uncanny Valley that inspired this video. It was a comment, specifically this comment. The Uncanny Valley implies that at some point there was an evolutionary reason to be afraid of something that looked human but wasn't. And that sent me down a rabbit hole. Could this evolutionary reason be other hominids? Well, there is some evidence to suggest Neanderthals engaged in cannibalism, and not only that, but interspecies predation. But okay, that's kinda unhinged. What about a predator? Well, mimicry is a very common strategy in the animal kingdom, and not only that, but some primates use it, even to this day. So clearly, this fear is grounded in something, and what I want to do is pull apart the most convincing theories to figure out what that something is. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The emotion behavior mismatch hypothesis is a mouthful, but basically, it's about psychopaths. It's a theory that suggests we're creeped out by facial expressions or behaviors that don't match the emotions we expect. And this does happen. Angela Tinwell found that when virtual characters speak, no movement in the upper face makes the character look disturbing, which explains a lot, like why so many horror characters move in strange, unnatural ways, or why clowns are so unsettling, acting cheerful while their faces stay stiff. But on its own, the theory just doesn't have enough evidence. For starters, it doesn't explain anatomical differences, like why pupils that are too big feel creepy. Second off, the Uncanny Valley is still felt by images, which throws a huge wrench in the idea that it's all about mismatched movement. But the biggest one, to me, is what would the selection pressure be? I mean, for something to become a universal instinct, the stakes have to be high. The people with better creep detectors had to incur some type of advantage. Not only that, but the threat also had to be consistent, showing up over hundreds of generations and across many different environments, enough that it can shape the entire species. So the theory makes sense, but as an origin story, I just don't see it holding up, unless you mix it with another one. For most of human history, we weren't alone. Aside from other humans, there were also other humans. Neanderthals, who were stronger, stockier, and more adapted to cool climates. Floresiensis, who were tiny, about 3 feet tall, and lived on the Indonesian islands. And finally, Denisovans, who we don't actually know what they look like. Regardless, all of them walked upright, had overlapping territory, and even similar faces. So aside from other groups of our own species, we also had interactions with other groups of humans, and they weren't always peaceful. Evidence from caves in France found Homo sapien bones with cut marks that resemble butchering, the kind you'd find on a prey carcass. There have also been Neanderthal fossils found with puncture wounds from projectiles, which Homo sapiens used more frequently than Neanderthals. And then there's the fact that a few thousand years after we expanded into Neanderthal territory, Neanderthals disappeared forever, leaving behind only 2% of their DNA, which some of us still carry today. Couple that with the fact that they had different gestures and movements, something we would have considered mismatched, and there's a pretty solid argument to suggest the Uncanny Valley comes from other humans. I mean, outsiders can be dangerous, right? Yeah, no. Personally, I don't think this theory is correct. Even if there was conflict, there were also peaceful interactions as well. and the very few remains that hint toward cannibalism or some type of predation can just as easily be explained by something else, like a spiritual ceremony or a rare time of desperation. And beyond the fact that the Uncanny Valley can be triggered by dolls or robots, wouldn't it be a far greater survival advantage to just evolve a fear of, say, aggression, rather than something that kind of looks human but isn't? Well, yeah, probably. So for a fear to be this specific and this instinctive, it had to be really costly to miss. And I think other human groups just don't fit into that category. However, there is another theory that does. One of the most powerful selection pressures in humans is parasites. There's even evidence to suggest that everything from morality to certain aspects of personality evolved from pathogen avoidance that became generalized. And because of that, some have extended it to the Uncanny Valley as well, suggesting that unsettling feeling is an instinct designed to help us avoid disease or corpses. And at first, it checks a lot of the boxes. It's a signal that would be costly to miss. It's a threat that would pop up often enough to shape entire populations, and there's a clear advantage to having this response. Add on to that the fact that a lot of the characteristics that make something unsettling fit into this kind of look of death, and you've got a solid theory. But here's the thing, by itself, it may be able to explain the origin of the Uncanny Valley, but not the intensity. I mean, you might avoid someone who's coughing or whatever, but you're not going to feel some existential anxiety towards it. And on top of that, disease cues in general are subtle. Pale skin or sunken eyes don't really fit into that ambiguity of almost humanness category. However, I do think if you were to use it as a starting point, its impact could be amplified by another one of the theories used to explain the Uncanny Valley.
Oh my.
There are many examples of sexual selection amplifying traits that originally served a different purpose. For example, MHC genes help your body recognize and fight off infections. Partners who had different MHC genes when,
Oh yeah.
pass on a wider range of immune defenses to fight off more infections. Over time, this becomes an instinctual preference for body odors linked to immune systems different from one's own. And that's why today, people have a preference for those who smell right in a dating context. It's actually a subconscious proxy for an immune system different from your own. In the animal kingdom, the classic example of this is the elk's antlers. Originally, they evolved as weapons, but over time, they started serving a different purpose, attracting mates. And whether it was because they looked more impressive or those who had bigger antlers won more fights, eventually, they became the norm in the population. It's a bit more complicated than that, but for the Uncanny Valley, the only thing we really have to understand is that sexual selection exaggerates existing traits. So if avoiding disease or infection was the origin, it's very plausible that sexual selection could have exaggerated this response into what the Uncanny Valley is today. And I say that for a few reasons. For starters, we're very attuned to certain ratios in the face. This is why averageness is one of the 3 pillars of beauty, along with sex differences and symmetry, which are all markers for health. Anyway, when someone has unconventional ratios, it's immediately striking. Not bad by any means, just striking. However, the more important the ratio is, say eye spacing for example, the more sensitive we are to even tiny deviations from the norm. And here's where it gets interesting. That sensitivity doesn't scale linearly, it's a threshold. Below it, the face just looks unique. But beyond a certain point, something flips. Suddenly, that face feels unsettling. And I bring this up because when I was looking at many different Uncanny Valley images to figure out what the commonalities are, the only trait that pops up every single time is a mismatch between the size of the pupil and the surrounding sclera, which coincidentally is also the part of these faces the majority find the most discomforting, the eyes. This matters because the sclera is like the billboard of intent. It's the only visible sign that reveals where someone's attention is, what they're feeling, or whether they might be sick. In fact, humans are the only primates with clearly visible white sclera exactly for this reason. Take that away, and you can't tell anything about a person. So what I'm suggesting is, what may have started as a way to avoid disease could have easily gotten exaggerated through sexual selection. The evidence for which is the preference humans have for averageness, which literally means facial features that closely match the statistical average across a population. But it wouldn't have stopped there, because faces, especially eyes, don't just signal health, they broadcast intent. And when certain expected ratios, especially in the sclera, are violated, the face becomes difficult to read, creating an uncertainty that isn't just confusing. In our past, it could have been deadly. So together, we have a model that fits the origin and the intensity we feel towards the uncanny valley. And out of all of the theories so far, I think this one makes the strongest case. I mean, it even fits with the mismatch psychopath detection theory from earlier. But honestly, there's one big knock on this idea. The uncanny valley doesn't just apply to faces. In fact, it even applies to sound. One thing is still bothering me about the other hominid theory that I didn't address earlier. We don't know what Denisovans look like. We know they ate a lot of meat and had jaw structures similar to those of archaic humans, but that's it. And when it comes to deciphering what something looked like based on a handful of remains, all you can do is speculate. I mean, scientists are still trying to figure out what dinosaurs look like, and we have full intact skeletons. So imagine how wrong we could be about Denisovans when all we have to go off of is a tooth, a couple bone fragments, and a tooth. They could have had very abnormal behavior, specialized in hunting other humans, and used some long forgotten strategy that got lost to time. Obviously, I don't think this is true, but it does illustrate a major point when it comes to our distant past. There are so many things that we still don't know. So a theory that suggests this fear comes from a creature that preyed on us is very possible, and as far as I know, there are two that fall into this camp. The predator theory, which hypothesizes there used to be a human-like creature that posed a threat to us, and the mimic theory, which suggests there was a species that evolved to look like humans to hunt us more effectively. What we do know is that early humans were prey to a lot of different things: big cats, birds of prey, and even some canines. Along with that, there are primates, specifically the slow loris, that evolved to look like spectacled cobras, even going so far as to mimic the hissing and movements. So could there be some combination of these two elements that gave rise to this fear? This is extremely speculative, but I do see one path. Mimicry is predominantly employed by insects, usually parasites. There are some reptiles like the Iranian sand viper and some birds like cowbirds that do it, but it's exceptionally rare in mammals. And this is because the more complex an organism is, the less useful mimicry becomes as a strategy. But only if you're trying to mimic how something looks like. And mimicry doesn't just apply to physical traits, it can apply to behavior, or more importantly, sound, which is one area I haven't seen anybody do research into, mimicking human sound. Margays have been seen copying baby tamarin cries to trick the adults into coming closer. Some birds of prey, like the African crowned eagle, have been observed mimicking the distress calls of monkeys for the same reason. There's even a very iffy historical account from Pliny the Elder that claimed hyenas imitate human voices to lure them in. All of these come from predators that once hunted humans or share the same family line. And if the uncanny valley applies to sound, which I mean, it does, just listen to this. Or this. Could it not be possible that it's a leftover instinct from a time when predators mimicked our cries? Well, maybe. And acceptation, which is when something evolves to do a new job it wasn't originally meant for, could take it a step further, generalizing this fear of mismatches into other sensory channels, like what something looks like, aka the uncanny valley. So that's it, right? Reason cracked? Well, it's an interesting idea and it's plausible, but using mimicry to hunt intelligent beings isn't exactly the best long-term strategy because we don't have to evolve to overcome threats. We can learn. And that's exactly why stealth is so powerful against us, which birds of prey and big cats use. If you're smart, you can learn to avoid a similar sounding cry, but you can't really learn to avoid something if you never see it coming. Which got me thinking, maybe it's not just about what falls into the uncanny valley. Maybe the real question here is, what actually makes something scary? And to me, it's not something that looks like it's dead or expressions that look like they're hiding something. What makes something scary is when it looks familiar, yet somehow looks like it shouldn't be. In other words, it's... Long before the uncanny valley had a name, Freud had his own theory to explain the same unsettling feeling. Unheimlich, he called it, which literally translates to the unhomelike, something that should feel familiar, but doesn't. What's interesting, however, is that the word Heimlich also has a second older meaning, hidden or concealed. So the word isn't just defined as the unfamiliar. It's the return of something once concealed that we wish hadn't. And when exploring different entities of the horror genre, this seems to be part of what makes them scary. For example, many cultures consider doppelgangers an omen of death, existing in a strange space between what is us and what is not. This blurred line could stir deep repressed feelings about identity. Zombies occupy a similar in-between state, not truly alive yet not entirely dead. Maybe they're such a common mythological trope because they bring up buried emotions tied to life and death. The uncanny valley, dolls, and even AI are things that try to mimic humans, be it in how they look or in their attempt at consciousness. Maybe this brings up repressed feelings about a loss of agency or a fear of being replaced. And there are so many other examples like werewolves, vampires, liminal spaces, and so on. These are all creatures and places and things about what happens when the boundary between real and fake, primal and socialized, empty and full, gets blurred. And it can trigger deep, uncomfortable feelings, which circles back to how ambiguity gives the unknown teeth. It creates a tension that we're desperate to solve. But while we navigate the world by simplifying it into tidy categories, real experiences tend to be harder to classify. That's why our default response is fear. If you're uncertain, it's better to be safe than sorry, right? But now, as we've become who we are today, living in societies shaped by culture, language, and memory, not everything ambiguous is a predator lurking in the dark. Sometimes it's a feeling, but because we can't categorize them, they get buried, only to resurface when some ambiguous thing in the real world resembles that which we've repressed. And so, if you were to ask me what I think causes the uncanny valley, I don't think it's any one theory. I think it's everything. Everything that once posed a threat that forced us to make a decision quickly. And today, even though ambiguity is no longer the immediate threat it once was, maybe it's more personal, and arguably, that's worse. But anyway, thanks for watching.